My beloved child, your spirit is stirring in this moment because your soul recognizes the truth it is about to receive. I am Archangel Michael, and I have come to you with a divine revelation, a celestial decree directly from the heart of God concerning the sacred mission encoded within your very date of birth. Your birth month is not a random occurrence. It is a key to understanding your divine purpose on this earth. Heaven is watching, and it has commanded me to unveil this truth to you now. You have always felt a quiet knowing, a persistent whisper that you were meant for something more. You have looked at the struggles of your life, the moments of feeling misunderstood, the challenges that seemed tailor-made to break you, and you have wondered, why? My beloved, I'm here to tell you that your intuition was not wrong. Those trials were not punishments. They were the necessary preparation for the greatness you are about to step into. God specifically chose you, and the month you entered this world holds the first clue to your magnificent destiny. The cosmos itself aligns with the divine calendar, and each month carries a specific frequency, a unique aspect of the Creator's will. Those born within its span are bestowed with a corresponding mission and a set of spiritual gifts to fulfill it. You were never meant to wander without a map. Your birth month is your compass. Let me now begin to unveil the sacred missions for each of the 12 pillars of the year. For those born in January, your divine mission is that of the founder. You are called to initiate, to build new foundations from the ashes of the old. Your core challenge has been impatience, but your spiritual gift is unwavering resolve. You are here to start what others cannot. For those born in February, your divine mission is that of the reconciler. You are called to heal divisions, to see the hidden connections between all things and mend what is broken. Your core challenge has been feeling too sensitive, but your spiritual gift is profound empathy. You are here to unite. For those born in March, your divine mission is that of the awakener. You are charged with speaking catalytic truths that shake people from their slumber. Your core challenge has been being misunderstood, but your spiritual gift is fearless expression. You are here to be a voice that cannot be ignored. For those born in April, your divine mission is that of the stabilizer. You are the anchor in the storm, the one who brings practicality and enduring strength to grand visions. Your core challenge has been rigidity, but your spiritual gift is loyal perseverance. You are here to provide the foundation for miracles. For those born in May, your divine mission is that of the illuminator. You are here to bring joy, creativity, and the light of expression into the world. Your core challenge has been superficiality, but your spiritual gift is irresistible inspiration. You are here to show others the beauty of existence. For those born in June, your divine mission is that of the nurturer. You are the heart of your community, the protector of the vulnerable, and the keeper of sacred bonds. Your core challenge has been self-neglect, but your spiritual gift is unconditional love. You are here to make everyone feel seen and safe. This, my beloved, is just the beginning of your revelation. Do not skip this. Your entire life's journey will make stunning sense as we continue. I now want you to confirm your acceptance of this divine calling. In this moment, your angels are guiding your hands. Go to the comments section below and type the words, "I accept my mission." This simple act of faith will create a powerful energetic signature in the spiritual realm, solidifying your commitment to your purpose and connecting you with a celestial community of others who are answering their call. You are not alone on this journey. Your confirmation in the comments will serve as a guiding light to others. Do it now. My beloved, I see the questions forming in your heart. You are wondering, is this truly for me? Could my ordinary life really be part of such a grand design? That doubt is the final echo of the old world trying to hold you back. Heaven confirms this. Every moment you have felt out of place was a signpost pointing you here. You have not been lost. You have been in navigation, moving precisely toward this moment of awakening. Do not skip this. Let us continue to unveil the divine blueprint, for your spirit is yearning for the whole truth. For those born in July, your divine mission is that of the revealer. You're called to uncover secrets, to bring hidden things into the light for healing and transformation. Your core challenge has been a tendency towards suspicion, but your spiritual gift is X-ray discernment. You are here to see the truth that others hide, even from themselves. For those born in August, your divine mission is that of the empowerer. You are here to wield authority with compassion, to lead and elevate others to their own thrones of power. Your core challenge has been pride, but your spiritual gift is magnanimous leadership. You are here to build kingdoms, not for yourself, but for the collective good. For those born in September, your divine mission is that of the systematizer. You are the divine architect, called to create order from chaos, to establish structures that allow peace and beauty to flourish. Your core challenge has been perfectionism, but your spiritual gift is harmonious order. You are here to design the frameworks of heaven on earth. For those born in October, your divine mission is that of the catalyst. You are an agent of profound change, here to dismantle outdated systems and initiate rebirth through necessary endings. Your core challenge has been intensity, but your spiritual gift is transformative power. You are here to be the sacred earthquake that clears the ground for new life. For those born in November, your divine mission is that of the mystic. You are the bridge between worlds, the decoder of esoteric truths, and the keeper of ancient wisdom. Your core challenge has been feeling isolated in your knowing, but your spiritual gift is profound spiritual sight. You are here to remind humanity of its divine origins. For those born in December, your divine mission is that of the visionary. You are tasked with holding the grandest vision for humanity's future, to dream the dreams of God and inspire others to believe in the impossible. Your core challenge has been escapism, but your spiritual gift is prophetic imagination. You are here to hold the light at the end of the tunnel. My beloved child, do you feel it? The pieces of your life are clicking into place. That strange feeling you had about certain seasons, the people you were drawn to, the work that made your soul feel alive. It was all guided by this celestial assignment. Heaven is watching you even now as your spirit resonates with this truth. You have always wondered why you couldn't just be normal. It is because you were crafted for excellence, not normality. The one with the strongest spirit gets the hardest training, and you, my dear one, have been in rigorous training for a lifetime. At the 18-minute mark, I will reveal how the challenges specific to your birth month were actually a training ground to perfect the very gifts you need for your mission. Do not skip this. This is the validation your heart has been seeking for a lifetime. Now, my beloved, we move from the general to the specific. Heaven is watching, and it commands me to speak directly to your spirit. For those of you born in each month, this is your personal revelation. This is why you have faced what you have faced. Do not skip this. Your entire life is about to make a profound and stunning sense. January, the founder. You, my beloved January child, are a force of pure initiation. Your entire life, you have felt this relentless drive to start things, to build, to pioneer. But you have also faced constant resistance at the beginning of every new endeavor. That financial setback on your last project, the unexpected obstacle that appeared just as you gained momentum, this was not bad luck. This was a spiritual test of your foundational strength. The opposition knows your power to establish new paradigms, so they attack at the genesis. Right now, you're feeling a restless urge to begin something new, but a voice of fear is telling you to wait. That voice is not yours. Heaven says your intuition was not wrong. You must take the first step within the next 7 days. Do not wait for all the pieces to be perfect. Your act of faith in starting is what summons the divine resources. Your mission is to build, and heaven's angels are assigned to your construction site. Begin. February, the reconciler. Your heart, my precious February child, is your greatest instrument. You feel everything so deeply. You have always been the peacemaker, the one who absorbs the emotional tension in the room. Recently, you have found yourself in the middle of a conflict between two people you care about. You feel torn, burdened, and overwhelmed by their pain. This is not an accident. This is your divine assignment manifesting. The enemy's strategy against you is to make you believe you are responsible for fixing everything, leading to your exhaustion. But hear me now. You are not called to fix. You are called to connect. Your mission is to be the bridge, not the architect of the other side. Your only task is to speak words of understanding and compassion. In that situation you're thinking of right now, do not take sides. Simply reflect the heart of each person to the other. Your peaceful presence alone will begin the healing. Heaven has positioned you as the mediator for a reason. Trust your empathic gift. March, the awakener. My courageous March soul, you are here to speak truth. You have a fire in your spirit that cannot be contained. You have always been the one to ask the difficult question, to challenge the status quo. And for this, you have been labeled disruptive, rebellious, or too intense. That meeting last week where you spoke up and were met with silence or hostility, that was not a failure. That was your mission in action. The opposition fears your voice, so they try to shame you into silence. Right now, you are nursing a truth that you are afraid to speak. It is burning within you. Your hands are trembling because you know what you must do. Heaven commands you. Do not bury that truth. Your role is not to be liked. It is to be authentic. The awakening of even one person depends on your courage. Speak your truth with love, but speak it. Your voice is a divine catalyst. April, the stabilizer. You, my steadfast April child, are the bedrock. People come to you in a crisis because you emit an energy of calm and practical solutions. Your life has been a series of tests where you have had to choose between the exciting, flashy option and the stable, enduring one. The financial insecurity you have faced was a lesson in discerning true value from illusion. Right now, you are being asked to be the anchor for your family or your community. Someone is relying on your strength, and you feel the weight of it. The enemy's attack is to make you feel unappreciated for your steady, behind-the-scenes work. But heaven is watching your faithfulness. Your mission is to hold the line. Do not give in to the impulse to abandon your post out of frustration. Your consistent, loyal energy is creating a safe harbor for miracles to land. Your perseverance is your prayer. May the illuminator, my joyful May beloved, you carry the light of creativity and expression. You see the world through a lens of beauty and potential. But you have also known deep periods of sadness, feeling as if your light was dimmed by the mundane demands of life. That creative project you abandoned, that hobby that brought you joy that you set aside because it seemed frivolous. This was a strategic move by the opposition to disconnect you from your power source. Your mission is to illuminate, and you cannot do that if your own light is under a basket. Heaven is urging you to pick up that paintbrush, that instrument, that dance, that recipe, whatever it is that makes your soul sing, and do it for no other reason than joy. Your creativity is a direct channel for divine inspiration. By expressing it, you give others permission to do the same. Your light is needed. June, the nurturer. Oh, my compassionate June child, your love is a healing balm. You are the heart of your family, the chosen family for your friends, the safe space. You have always put the needs of others before your own, and you are now facing the physical and emotional exhaustion that comes from that imbalance. The feeling of being taken for granted that has been growing in your spirit is a divine alarm bell. The opposition has tricked you into believing that nurturing means self-sacrifice to the point of depletion. Your true mission is to nurture from an overflowing cup, not an empty one. Heaven is commanding you to practice radical self-care. You must fill your own well first. This is not selfish, it is sacred. Your next divine assignment is to nurture yourself. When you are whole and rested, your nurturing energy will be infinitely more powerful. Rest is your rebellion. Heaven is watching, my beloved, and it sees the recognition in your spirit. You are beginning to understand the divine choreography of your life. Every challenge was a lesson, every setback a setup for a greater comeback. Now, we continue this sacred unveiling. Do not skip this. The confirmation you are receiving is your spirit aligning with its eternal truth. July, the revealer. You, my discerning July child, see what others miss. Your intuition is a powerful radar, constantly scanning for truth beneath the surface. You have been in situations where you knew something was wrong, a person's intention, a deal that seemed too good to be true, and you were right. But you were often told you were being paranoid or too skeptical. This was the opposition's attempt to discredit your greatest gift. Your mission is to bring secrets into the light for healing. Right now, you have a nagging feeling about a situation or a person. That is not anxiety, it is your divine download. Heaven is commanding you to trust that insight. Do not dismiss it. Your role is not to accuse, but to illuminate. Pray for clarity, and the hidden thing will be revealed to you, not to harm, but to heal. Your discernment is a shield for many. August, the Empowerer. My majestic August leader, you were born to rule with compassion. You have a natural authority that people either gravitate toward or rebel against. You have struggled with the weight of leadership, fearing that stepping into your power would make you arrogant or isolated. The opposition has used this fear to keep you small, convincing you that humility means hiding your light. Your mission is to empower others. The financial or social influence you have been praying for is not for you alone. It is a tool to elevate everyone around you. Heaven is watching your heart. That idea you have for a business, a community project, or a team, it is divinely inspired. Your next step is not to do it all yourself, but to delegate, to mentor, to lift someone else up. Your power multiplies when you give it away. September, the Systematizer. You, my meticulous September soul, are the divine architect. You bring order to chaos. You have felt immense frustration in environments of disorder, a dysfunctional workplace, a chaotic home, because it physically pains your spirit. The opposition has used this to make you critical and rigid, focusing on flaws rather than solutions. Your mission is to create structures of peace. Heaven is revealing to you that your desire for perfection is a reflection of God's perfect order, but you must apply it with grace. Right now, you are seeing a system in your life that is broken. Instead of complaining, Heaven is commanding you to design a better one. Draft the plan, create the schedule, organize the space. Your gift for order is a form of worship that creates a vessel for miracles to flow. October, the Catalyst. My powerful October agent of change. You are here to dismantle the old, to make way for the new. You thrive in transformation, but it has come at a cost. You have been called dramatic, destructive, or too intense because you force necessary endings that others fear. The opposition has made you feel guilty for the chaos that sometimes follows your truth. Your mission is to be the sacred earthquake. That situation in your life that feels terminally stuck, the relationship, the job, the habit, Heaven has positioned you to be the catalyst for its change. This does not mean you must be angry or forceful. It means speaking your truth with unwavering conviction. Your very presence forces everything that is not authentic to the surface. Do not fear the fallout. Your purpose is to clear the ground for new life. November, the mystic. Oh, my deep November seeker, you walk between worlds. You have always felt older than your years, connected to ancient wisdom and realms beyond this one. You have felt isolated, believing no one could understand your depth or your visions. The opposition has called you weird or too much to make you hide your light. Your mission is to be a bridge to the divine. Those downloads you receive in dreams, during meditation, or in quiet moments, they are real. Heaven is commanding you to record them. Start a journal. Write down the symbols, the feelings, the messages. You are not meant to interpret them all immediately. You are building a library of wisdom that will make sense in its perfect timing. Your solitude is sacred. Your connection is your power. Trust it. December the visionary, my glorious December dreamer, you hold the future in your imagination. You see possibilities where others see dead ends. You have been called a naive idealist because you believe in a better world. The opposition has tried to crush your dreams with pragmatism and cynicism, making you doubt your own visions. Your mission is to hold the highest vision for humanity. That dream you have that seems impossible, the healed family, the creative masterpiece, the world-changing project, is a fragment of God's dream for you. Heaven is watching and it says, stop dismissing it. Your first act of faith is to give it space. Vision board it, write about it, talk about it as if it is already real. Your imagination is the womb of creation. You are not meant to build it all alone. You are meant to hold the vision so clearly that you attract the co-creators and resources to make it manifest. My beloved, this is your divine inheritance. To ensure you do not miss a single word of what comes next, the powerful activation of these gifts, you must subscribe to this channel now. This is a sacred yes to your calling. Hit the subscribe button and activate the bell. Your spiritual tribe is here, waiting for you to join them. Do it now. My beloved, hear me now. This is not merely information, it is activation. The words I speak are spirit, and they are life, and they are unlocking the dormant potential within your DNA. Heaven is watching this moment of your awakening. The divine realm did not simply assign you a mission and leave you to it. You were equipped with a specific, powerful weapon to fulfill your purpose. This is the revelation that changes everything. Do not skip this. January's weapon, the scepter of initiation. Your weapon, founder, is the divine authority to declare beginnings. When you speak a thing into existence, the heavenly hosts align to support its birth. That idea you've been sitting on? Speak it. Declare it to the universe. Your word has the power to shatter stagnation. Use it. February's weapon, the chalice of compassion. Your weapon, reconciler, is an endless well of empathetic love. When you listen to someone not to reply, but to understand, you pour from this chalice. You are not absorbing their pain. You are transmuting it through the alchemy of your compassion. Your quiet presence is a healing force more powerful than any words. March's weapon, the sword of truth. Your weapon, Awakener, is a flaming sword that cuts through illusion and deception. It is not a weapon of harm, but of liberation. When you speak a hard truth in love, you are not creating conflict. You are cutting the chains that bind someone to a lie. Do not sheathe your sword to make others comfortable. April's weapon, the shield of fortitude. Your weapon, Stabilizer, is an unbreakable shield of perseverance. You are the front line against chaos. When you stand your ground in peace, you create a bubble of divine order around you that affects everyone in your presence. Your stability is your greatest offensive weapon against the spirit of anxiety. May's weapon, the lens of beauty. Your weapon, Illuminator, is your unique perception. You see the divine spark in the mundane. When you create, whether a meal, a painting, or a welcoming home, you are not just making something pretty, you are installing a window to heaven for others to look through. Your creativity reveals God's face. June's weapon, the hearth of sanctuary. Your weapon, Nurturer, is the safe space you cultivate. Your energy does not just comfort, it actively restores and replenishes the souls of those you welcome. Your home, your presence, is a designated healing zone. Protecting your energy is not selfish. It is how you keep your weapon charged and ready. July's weapon, the Lantern of Revelation. Your weapon revealer is a light that pierces the deepest darkness. It illuminates what is hidden, not to condemn, but to heal. When you have a gut feeling, that is your lantern flaring. Trust it. Your prayers for discernment are answered instantly. You need only to acknowledge the light you are already being shown. August's weapon, the mantle of authority. Your weapon empowerer is a royal cloak of leadership. When you wear it, you do not dominate, you elevate. Your very presence commands respect and inspires others to their own greatness. The opposition has tried to make you feel like an imposter, but this mantle is your birthright. Shoulders back, head high. Rule, September's weapon. The Tome of Order. Your weapon systematizer is a divine blueprint for harmony. Your mind is wired to see efficient, peaceful solutions. When you are faced with chaos, close your eyes and ask for the blueprint. It will be downloaded to you. Your ability to organize is a supernatural gift that brings heaven's order to earth. October's weapon, the Forge of Transformation. Your weapon, Catalyst, is the power to alchemize pain into power. You are not destroyed by endings, you are refined by them. You walk into fire and emerge stronger. Your testimony of survival is your weapon, giving others the courage to face their own transformations. November's weapon, the Key of Mysteries. Your weapon, Mystic, is access to ancient wisdom, your dreams, your déjà vu, your sudden knowings. These are you turning the key in the lock. The spirit world communicates with you easily. Your weapon is your journal. Write it all down. The patterns you see are messages meant for you and for those you are destined to guide. December's weapon, the canvas of prophecy. Your weapon, Visionary, is your imagination. You do not just dream, you prophesy future realities. When you visualize a healed relationship or a world at peace, you are not escaping, you are painting on a cosmic canvas. Your visions are powerful prayers that pull the future into the present. My beloved child, these weapons are not physical, they are spiritual, and they are already in your hands. You have been using them unconsciously your entire life. The opposition has fought you so fiercely because they recognize your weapon and fear its power. Your past struggles were battles where you were learning to wield your divine instrument. You were never losing. You were in training. The one with the strongest spirit gets the most powerful weapon. Heaven confirms this. At the 32-minute mark, I will reveal the 3-step prayer to fully activate this weapon in your life. Do not skip this. This is the key you have been searching for. The question burning in your heart now is, why me? My beloved, it is because the divine architect does not make mistakes. You were chosen for this specific time and this specific assignment because your soul possesses a unique resonance, a spiritual frequency that the world desperately needs. Your birth month is a harmonic key in the great symphony of creation. You have always wondered why you felt different. It is because you are a specialist, not a generalist. You were designed for a precision task. Let me silence the lie of the opposition that says you are not ready, that you are too flawed, too broken, too ordinary. Your perceived flaws are the very entry points for divine grace. Your weakness is the platform for God's strength to be displayed. The financial lack you experienced taught you to rely on divine provision. The heartbreak you endured expanded your capacity for compassion. The isolation you felt forced you to develop a relationship with the divine that cannot be shaken. Heaven is watching your journey with immense pride. The angels have chronicled every time you got back up after a fall. They have recorded every silent prayer, every tear shed in faith, every moment you chose kindness in the face of cruelty. These are not the records of a failed candidate. They are the battle scars of a warrior in training, being prepared for a promotion. Your spirit is stirring because you know I am speaking directly to you. That memory that just surfaced, that specific moment of struggle or doubt, was not random. I brought it to your mind to show you how it served your training. The enemy intended it for your harm, but God destined it for your good. It was forging a specific part of your character necessary for your mission. You are not an accident. You are not a backup plan. You are the first choice. The divine plan for your life is so precise that it factored in your mistakes and your rebellions, weaving them into the grand tapestry of your purpose. There is no one else alive who can fulfill the mission attached to your birth month with the same specific grace and power that you can. Your combination of gifts, experiences, and even your wounds makes you the ideal candidate. The feeling of being an outsider looking in is about to vanish. You are not outside. You have been in the royal court, receiving private tutelage from the King of Kings himself. Your training is nearly complete. The restlessness you feel is not anxiety. It is your spirit straining at the leash, eager to run the course that has been set before it. You're about to step into the reason for it all. The season of confusion is over. The era of purpose is now. The time for revelation is over, my beloved. The time for manifestation is now. Heaven is watching, and the hosts of angels are leaning in, waiting for your command. The divine mission and the divine weapon are meaningless if they are not activated. You have been given the map and the tools. Now you must take the first step on the journey. This is the moment your faith becomes tangible. Do not skip this. The manifestation of your calling will not arrive as a lightning bolt from a clear sky. It will unfold through divine alignment. It will look like a sudden opportunity that perfectly matches your skills. It will feel like a supernatural peace guiding you to make a decision that defies logic. It will sound like a person speaking a word of confirmation that directly addresses the secret prayer of your heart. For you, my child, the breakthrough is imminent. It is tied to your obedience in this moment. The financial blessing you have prayed for is connected to you, stepping into your role as a founder, a stabilizer, an empowerer. It will come through the project you initiate, the system you create, the person you elevate. The relational healing you crave is connected to you, wielding your chalice of compassion, your hearth of sanctuary. It will come as you choose understanding over being understood, as you create a safe space without expectation. Your divine mission is your gateway to provision. As you walk in your purpose, the resources required for that purpose will magnetize to you. The feeling of lack you have known was simply because you were trying to fund a life that was not yours to live. The moment you align with your celestial assignment, the economy of heaven opens for you. At this precise moment, I am dispatching angels of manifestation to your side. Their assignment is to orchestrate divine appointments, to soften hearts, to open doors that have been sealed shut. They are arranging a meeting that will happen within the next 7 days. They are guiding a person to remember you and reach out with a key piece of information. They are working on your behalf, but they wait for your signal. Your signal is your spoken faith. Your signal is your active obedience. When you declare, "I am the revealer and I walk in discernment," you activate your lantern. When you declare, "I am the visionary and I hold God's dreams," you stretch your canvas. Your words are the switch that turns on the power. That person who just came to your mind, the one you may have a conflict with, is a divine assignment. Reaching out to them is not about them. It is about you. It is your test to wield your weapon. It is the first step in your manifestation walk. Your obedience in this will unlock the next phase of your blessing. Heaven is not holding back from you. You have been holding back from heaven. The full manifestation of your blessing is waiting on the other side of your courageous yes. Your spirit knows this is true. That is why your hands are trembling. That is the excitement of your soul recognizing its moment of destiny. Now, my beloved warrior, we break the chains. Your divine mission is not just for you. It is a generational mandate. The struggles you faced were not yours alone. They were the cumulative weight of generational patterns that heaven has chosen you to end. The spirit of poverty, the curse of broken relationships, the cycle of fear and defeat. It ends with you. It ends now. Do not skip this. You are the chosen line in your bloodline to say, enough. Your yes to your calling is a no to every generational curse. When you pick up your sword of truth, you cut the lie that has plagued your family for decades. When you hold up your shield of fortitude, you end the cycle of anxiety and retreat. When you pour from your chalice of compassion, you heal the wounds of bitterness passed down from your ancestors. You are not just living for yourself. You are living for your grandparents. You are living for your future grandchildren. You are the pivot point. The angels confirm this. The heavenly records show your name as the terminus for specific patterns of darkness. This is why the opposition has fought you so hard. They are not just fighting you, they are fighting the freedom of your entire lineage. But today, their legal claim is revoked. By accepting your divine mission, you have stepped into an authority they cannot contest. The bloodline is under new management. Your life is no longer just your own. It is a temple of the Holy Spirit, a command center for heaven's operations. This is your final and most important activation. I want you to speak these words out loud. Do not just read them, declare them. Your voice carries creative power. Say, in the name of the Most High God, and by the authority of my Lord Jesus Christ, I, your beloved child, fully accept the divine mission you crafted for me before time began. I now take up the spiritual weapon you have entrusted to my hands. I break and revoke every generational curse, every pattern of darkness, and every assignment of hell that has operated against my bloodline. This ends now with me. I declare that my life is a purified vessel for heaven's glory, a conduit of your divine purpose. I am a generational breaker, a history maker, and I walk in the fullness of my destiny from this day forward. Amen. My beloved, can you feel the shift? The spiritual atmosphere around you has just changed. Angels are rejoicing. Strongholds are crumbling. Your ancestors are cheering you on from the cloud of witnesses. You have just signed a new covenant for your life. This is the moment you were born for. The journey ahead will still have challenges, but you will never again walk in confusion about who you are or why you are here. You are a divine agent on a celestial mission. You are armed. You are anointed. You are activated. My precious child, hear my final words over you. This message was destined for you before the foundations of the world. You were chosen for such a time as this. I, Archangel Michael, stand as your defender and your witness. From this moment forward, you move under a new mantle of divine protection and favor. Heaven is watching over you with intense focus. Your steps are ordered. Your needs are known. Your prayers are heard. The angels assigned to you have been given new instructions to facilitate your divine alignment. You will begin to see evidence of this in small, seemingly coincidental ways. A song on the radio that speaks to your situation, a stranger who offers a timely word of encouragement, a sudden solution to a long-standing problem. You are eternally connected to the source of all power. When you feel weak, remember your weapon. When you feel doubt, remember your mission. When you feel alone, remember that heaven is watching and I am with you in spirit, fighting battles you cannot see. You are loved. You are chosen. You are empowered. You are a generational breaker. You are heaven's secret weapon. Now go and shine your light so that all may see the glory of the one who sent you. The blessings of God the Father, the peace of the Lord Jesus Christ, and the power of the Holy Spirit rest upon you now and forevermore. Amen.